Imagine a thirsty traveller trying to catch a flowing river in a calabash, and you may have some idea of the impossible task facing a compiler of an anthology of this sort. The source may be known, the direction clear, but inevitably much spills out, leaving only a taste of those precious waters. The thirst for literature with personal relevance has inspired many black women's creativity. Toni Morrison has explained that she writes the books she wants to read, a sentiment endorsed by Alice Walker. I write all the things I should have been able to read, as well as by the young Zimbabwean novelist Tsitsi Dangarembga, who has said, I tried to look for myself in the books that I read, but I didn't find me. Similarly, perhaps the first reason for the contents of this anthology is subjective. It's a sort of anthology I wish I had had access to years ago, which did not exist.
Hello and welcome to the New Daughters of Africa podcast. This is the very first podcast that we're hosting today. My name is Panashe Chigumadzi, and we have the honor of having Margaret Busby as our first guest. Margaret is a woman who's often known by the many firsts that are attached to the name or her name. It is, people know her as the first Black woman to have started a publishing house, the youngest Black woman in Britain. But Margaret is someone who is so much bigger than the story of her first. Margaret is someone who really is the culmination of generations, those who've come before her, those who come with her, those who go after her, someone who really catches and is a tributary of a wonderful feminist, Pan-Africanist history. And I'm so glad to have her here. New Daughters of Africa is just one manifestation of this wonderful spirit that she has carried for us, for our particular generation. But really, Margaret Busby is someone that as you can hear, I'm in awe of, because of the kind of humility and grace with which she carries all of the remarkable achievements and accolades that she has had and continues to receive over the years. So we're really grateful to have you here with us, Margaret. Such an honor. I met you for the first time at the New Daughters of Africa launch in London at SOAS, and it was just such a wonderful celebration of Black women from everywhere you can think of, from Antigua to Zimbabwe, from Bahia to Benin. It was really such a great gathering, and it was such a testament to you to have that kind of vision, to be able to gather us in the way that you did. It's really something that's all too rare in an era where Pan-Africanism might sound a bit retrograde, where people might only think of Pan-Africanism as something that, the AU or the African Union does. You really give us an inspiring vision, and to have all those people having shown up and turned out for you across generation, across just so many different ways in which you brought us together. I was really so proud to be part of that moment and get to meet you, and subsequently have met you in person many other times. But what an honor it was, and what an honor it is to have you today, Margaret.
Wow, that was an amazing introduction, Panashe. Thank you so much.
And you will know, to our listeners, that Margaret is someone who can be incredibly humble, despite all the many things that she has achieved. So I will try my best to remind you, if you don't already know, what she has done. And I think we'll just really start with, in recognizing the genius of Margaret's vision, it's really the sense of the fact that Margaret's genius is not a singular genius, it is the genius of generations. And as I was saying to Margaret earlier today, that I often quote her maternal grandfather, George James Christian, in my own writings, about Pan-Africanism. Particularly, it was an address that he had held, or session that he'd held at the first Pan-African Congress in London in 1900. So this was the first gathering for Black peoples across the Atlantic, across the Indian Oceans, really across all the waters of the world. And her grandfather was part of this, and in outlining a really visionary kind of understanding of history, understanding of struggle. He was writing at that time about what was happening in British South Africa. He was drawing a transatlantic line between, in his words, the Africans who'd been jostled out of their lands in the 16th century and the Africans who are being jostled out of their lands now in what was the turn of the 20th century at that time. So that kind of historic vision and consciousness is what I think about when I think of Margaret Busby. So you then think, of course, she would be the person who would be the convener of Daughters of Africa, the first such anthology for people or women of African descent. So Margaret, I'm interested in knowing, and I think that the real theme for me today, if there's one, it's thinking about the many roots and routes of Margaret Busby, thinking about the rivers of your being. How do we get to the place in which we now have the new Daughters of Africa? Can you start by telling us a little bit about your family and about that lineage that creates you?
Yes, that is a really important thing to think about, because obviously, as I have often said, I didn't fall from the sky. I am the sum of everything that went before me, all the people I've met in my life, and of course, my family. And my family comes from so many different places, but it is rooted in Africa. I mean, you talked about my grandfather, George James Christian, who was born in Dominica. But he had ancestors, family in Antigua. And he came to Britain in 1899 to study law, and he was a delegate at the first Pan African Conference, as you said, in 1900. And he migrated to Ghana in 1902. In fact, his house in Ghana, in a place called Sekondi, was called Dominica House. So that's my maternal grandfather. I didn't meet him. He died in 1940 before I was born. But my mother was his first African child, his first Ghanaian or Gold Coast born child. So I was born in Ghana. My mother was born in Ghana. Her mother was born in Ghana, but her father was born in the Caribbean. My father was born in Barbados. And when he was 6 weeks old, he and his family moved to Trinidad. His father was a tailor, so he moved to Trinidad. 6 weeks in Barbados, 20 years in Trinidad. He was a bright boy, so he won scholarships. He won the Ireland Scholarship, which enabled him to go and study at a British university. So he studied medicine, first of all in Edinburgh. He left Trinidad in 1919. He went to Edinburgh. He qualified as a doctor in Dublin. And then he came to practice medicine in East London. So he was a GP in London in the 20s. And then in 1929, he too migrated to Ghana. And he, like some of a few West Indians who had gone to Ghana in the early part of the 20th century, they were like extended family, and they'd all gather at Dominica House, which is my maternal grandfather's house. He was like the senior member of that community. So they all gathered there for holidays or whatever. So my father went there, and that's how he met my mother. That was the connection. So you've got the connection, Gold Coast, Ghana, Barbados, Trinidad, Antigua, Dominica. All those places are part of the Pan-African story that make up my life. My mother's mother was born in Ghana. She was from an area called Sekondi, which is where my grandfather's house was. She was, I knew her. She was a very bright woman, but she was not literate in terms of, knowing how to read or write, but she was a hard worker. And so that ethos was passed on to my mother, onto me. So I'm getting all these wonderful sort of messages, all these examples from my family. My father, when he was in Ghana, or the Gold Coast as it was then, he was one of the pioneering doctors who practiced in the rural areas. There were no medical services in the bush, as it was called then. So he had a clinic in a place called Suhum. And he and my mother had married in 1941. My mother, who trained as a nurse in Britain, her father had earned enough money to send his children, get them educated. So my mother, she didn't become a doctor, she became a nurse, but some of his other children became doctors. My grandfather's other children became doctors and lawyers. My mother was a nurse. She joined my father working in this dispensary in Suhum, in the bush, as we called it. But my father had a very high esteem for British education, particularly because he had been educated in Trinidad in Queen's Royal College. It was a premier school in Port of Spain. My father wanted my brother George, my sister Eileen, and me, I was the youngest of the three children there, to have a good education. But there were no schools in that area that we could have gone to. So they struggled, they did their best, and we were sent to school in Britain. So that was my route to education. I went to a boarding school in Sussex, in Britain, and I was bright. I know I was because I was the youngest youngest child in the school. I've
Yes.
got some of the old school reports, and they didn't want to take me, but they had to take me because I was with my sister, and I met the head mistress many years later when she was 100. She died a few years ago, and she said that the reason she'd taken me, although I was so young, was that her name was Eileen, which is my sister's name, and the deputy headmistress's name was Margaret, which is my
Yeah.
name. So she said, "Well, we've got to take them. They're Eileen and Margaret." So I was at this
Yeah.
school. I was the youngest girl in the school. It was an international school. Eileen and I were the first African girls, but there were friends I had later from Nigeria, from Trinidad, from Liberia, from Malaysia, from all around the world. And I did my O levels when I was 14. I left school when I was 15. Then in fact, I went back to Ghana for a year and I did some A levels. And I came back to Britain. I did some more A levels and I applied to university. I went to university when I was 17. And while I was at university, I met another undergraduate who was a friend of the fiance of a friend of mine. Because in my school holidays at school, when I was at boarding school, my parents couldn't afford to bring us home to Ghana or come here to Britain all the time. In fact, my mother told me she had one dress which she'd wear in the day, wash at night, and wear the next day because she was
Right.
saving money to pay for our education. And in the school holidays, we stayed in this holiday home in Sussex, which was run by an English woman who was a writer. Her husband died, and she had to sustain herself and her five children by taking in children from other parents who, for whatever reason, couldn't go home in the holidays. And of her children, one of them, Rachel Anderson, was a very good friend of mine. And she was getting married and having her first novel published while I was at university and was having a party in London. Her fiance, soon to be husband, was there, and he had invited his friends. One of his friends was a guy who I was introduced to because he was like me doing things at his university college to do with publishing, writing poetry, college magazine. His name was Clive Allison. And we discussed what we might do when we graduated. And we were both interested in poetry, particularly. We wanted to find poetry books that young people like us could afford. That was the era, I suppose, of the beat poets and so on. So we said, okay, let's start a publishing company.
By the time you're meeting your future partner, Alison, or your partner in publishing, there's some kind of desire that's been building up for a while to have particular kinds of books being published. And there's a kind of meeting of the minds there when you decide that, right, this is the time. Had it been that you were thinking of publishing specifically at that time, or you were thinking of having a different kind of career?
Well, I was always interested in art. I was painting at that time. But I was very conscious that my family was full of people who thought that the real professions were things like medicine and law. And so at the same time as I went to Bedford College, I got a place at Bedford College to read English, but I also was enrolled at Gray's Inn to study law.
Oh, wow. Like your
So,
grandfather.
like my grandfather, the old Gray's Inn was where he studied. But I took you had to eat a certain number of dinners. They had these rituals to eat enough dinners before you can be called to the bar. So I ate all the dinners, but I didn't actually do the exams.
Yeah.
Because before I did the exams, I'd actually got into the publishing stream. So, but that was, I suppose, that was a fallback position. So that if anybody had said, "Well, publishing's not a real career, you must do law," I would have taken that path, perhaps. But I didn't. I could still take the law exams and become a lawyer, I suppose. But my next career, but publishing was something I was interested in because I had always written poetry. Don't tell anybody, but I wrote poetry.
Where can we find it? In what publications?
Well, I've got a school magazine from 1959. It's a poem of mine which won some inter-schools poetry prize,
Oh wow, I'd love to read
which
that.
was called the Patchwork Quilt. So I don't know where I got this idea from. I've got other things. I've got some college magazines. In fact, I've also got a letter. I wrote a letter to Lewis and Kosi
Oh wow,
when
that's fantastic.
he was editing New African magazine, and I was obviously very forward at that. I must have been, I don't know, I just left university, so I might have been 20 or 21. I'd written him this letter saying, "I've got all this poetry. Would you like to publish something?" He did publish some poetry in the New African.
That's amazing. So if we go to New African, we're going to find some poetry by a young Margaret
You
Busby.
won't find it. But I mean, the thing was, I realized what it is when you're that young, you don't know what you're not meant to do. You don't know what the conventions are. You don't know what you're not meant to say, or what you're not aware of things. You just say, "I want to do this or that, so I'll do it."
Well, I think it's a great spirit. I mean, because you were 23 when you decided, I just want to do it, and you started Addison and Busby.
Well, I think we started publishing because we wanted to publish poetry to begin with in young people like ourselves could afford. So that mostly at that time you found poetry in slim hardback volumes which were expensive. And we
Right.
wanted to publish paperback poetry books at 5 shillings a piece. We didn't know how many copies one printed of any kind of book, and we didn't have any money. There was somebody Clive knew who could typeset the books on an electric typewriter. We didn't know how many copies. We printed 5,000 copies of 3 poetry books. So we had 15,000 poetry books costing 5 shillings each. And we had no distribution. We had no idea what to do. But we would stop people in the streets saying, "Do you want to buy a book?" Or knock on doors. So that was how we
Yeah.
began. And of course, we had no money. So we both had to get jobs in other publishing companies. So I got a job with a company called the Cresset Press, which then became Barry and Rockcliffe. I tried to get jobs. I'd written letters of application when I saw jobs advertised. I remember one job application I made, and I got an interview by post. I applied by post. I got an interview by post. I turned up for the interview, and they said, "There's a black girl here who says she's got an interview." So that was the era. That was not the done thing to see black women trying to get into publishing. And so Clive Allison and I both got jobs with other publishing companies. And we tried to do our own publishing in the evenings and at weekends. So in fact, you have a day job and then you go and do Allison and Busby in the weekend. So that's how we operated. And in fact, let me tell you something else. People assume that Clive Allison and I were an item. No, I was actually married to a jazz musician. And so, he was not earning a lot of money either. And so then what happened when we were both working in these proper day jobs? There's a friend of my husband Lionel's who was on a Greek island. He was from Greece. He was on Mykonos, and he bumped into this African American writer called Sam Greenlee, who'd written his first novel and had been trying to get it published. Had tried, maybe 40 publishers on both sides of the Atlantic. Nobody wanted his book. And so Alexis Lickiard, this friend of my husband, said, "Oh, I know somebody who started a publishing company." And he directed Sam Greenlee to me in London. And eventually we decided this is going to be our first full-time novel. So Clive Allison and I both left our jobs and
Wow.
decided to go full-time and publish this first novel by an African American called Sam Greenlee. And so I worked on the manuscript with Sam,
Mm-hmm.
edited it. I did the cover myself with Letraset.
Wow.
Cover myself. We had to do everything ourselves. We had nobody to employ. And then we had this manuscript. We wanted to go to publish in March 1969. We wanted to get it serialized. So it was a really powerful political thriller. The CIA wanting to have a black employee to show that they were integrated. So,
I mean, that's so relevant right now. We are
exactly. So
it
they
couldn't be
employed this
more
man.
relevant in this George Floyd moment.
We thought this was a really powerful political novel. We ought to get this serialized in a national newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
So we sent the manuscript off to the Observer, saying, would you like to serialize this first novel we're about to publish? And the Observer politely declined. They said, you ought to know we really don't serialize fiction, and if we did it, our first novel like this.
No, I mean, this is, post Windrush, this is sort of, has the Rivers of Blood speech already been made by Enoch Powell?
But we were not having it. You see, we decided they were wrong, so we sent it back to them, saying, "Listen, you're wrong," and they ended up doing it.
Wow!
Mm-hmm. They serialized, printed extracts in the Observer Color magazine in March 1969.
That's amazing.
Because we didn't know we weren't meant to do that. So we went on from there. The book became successful. We sold translation rights around the world. We sold it back to America. And it was made into a film, which became a sort of cult movie. So we were doing things because we believed in them, because we thought they should be done. So that was the virtue of being young and bold. And
so with The Spook Who Sat by the Door, you have your first international bestseller.
Well, if you put it like that, but it's not that it made us a fortune or made anybody a fortune, but it certainly got noticed everywhere. It was, in fact, I remember somebody called it a succès de name drop. It was well reviewed everywhere. It was reviewed everywhere. But in fact, once when we did the paperback edition of it, I did the back cover, taking out all the most powerful adjectives from all the reviews. So it mostly said, frightening, terrifying, astonishing. All those frightening happened in most of the reviews. So that was our first book that really got a lot of attention. Yes, that was certainly so.
Right, exactly. And I mean, you've done so much all this time. I mean, within Alison Busby, the people you had published, you had republished Sarah James, you've done a whole, and, brought his work out of obscurity. There's so much and so many different awards that you won. Buche Mecheta, for example, from my home country, someone like Maurice Nyagumbo, for example. There's so much. And really, what was your editorial vision in that time?
One of the things that I always wanted to see happen was to be able to make current, to publicize, to make public work, books, writing by people that I thought deserved to be heard. I mean, that's what publishing is about, to make something public. So we were publishing books that they might have been first books, they might have been new novelists, they might have been books that had gone out of print, rescuing books, bringing books back into print because they were neglected, because they were ignored, because they'd been out of print. In fact, that was what happened with C.L.R. James. I mean, as I said, C.L.R. James had been a friend of my father's since their school days, and so he was like a family friend. I knew he was important. I'd read his work, and yet he was practically completely out of print when I was publishing in the 70s. So one of the things we did was we brought back a lot of his work into print. I started with 3 volumes of selected writings by C.L.R. James: The Future and the Present, Spheres of Existence, and At the Rendezvous of Victory. And we published other books by him, reprinted books that had gone out of print. Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution was a book that had not been printed before. We reprinted Black Jacobins, which was his seminal book he published in 1938, which was out of print in Britain. It's now seen as a really important historical text about the Haitian Revolution. It was out of print, so that
we have you to thank for that. Yeah.
We were bringing back into print books, writers, another Caribbean writer, George Lanning, we brought back into print. And that was really what I was pleased to be able to do. It was like an alternative to what was already being publishing. We were publishing things that we thought deserved to be seen by people. In fact,
Right.
one of the best tributes I remember somebody paying
Mm-hmm.
to me was to say, well, you never knew what Alison Busby was going to publish next. But you knew it
Right.
was going to be interesting.
And what's then your journey over the next how many years? I think you had quite a successful run with Alison and Busby, but of course, in that time, as you've spoken about, you also faced a number of challenges as a young Black woman in the sort of UK literary industry.
I think that the publishing industry at that time was certainly not at all diverse. And you can see that just from the sorts of coverage our books got. If you look at some
Mm-hmm.
of the headlines, I remember one headline in particular that said, "The girl from Ghana goes into publishing," which is, it was really just showing astonishment. This African woman
Mm-hmm.
could actually read or write, let alone go into
Mm-hmm.
publishing. So there was that sort of feeling that it was a freakish thing to be doing, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it also came through in terms of the way people saw the partnership,
Mm-hmm.
Alison and Busby, because Clive Allison happened to be a white man, and
Mm-hmm.
here I am, an African Black woman. And so people assumed that he was the boss. So from the window cleaner to the bank manager, that was the assumption. If you wanted something done, you had to speak to him. And, it had all sorts of ways it impacted on the publishing company. I don't even know how, but in the end, what happened? The company was taken over. We ran out of money. I can think of a lot of reasons why it happened, and a lot of them were to do with that societal prejudice about who was in charge. And so, if the person in charge was not doing what they were meant to do, then you didn't go and see the other person because they were
Mm-hmm.
just a Black woman. So I left Alison Busby at the end of the 80s, and I then was editorial director for another company called Earthscan,
Mm-hmm.
which I was at till about 1990, and then I went freelance. But also all along the way, I've been doing other things such as
Mm-hmm.
broadcasting. I was
Mm-hmm.
involved in the late 60s when we were trying to piece together a living to do Alison and Busby. I had a program at the BBC African Service called Break for Women.
And as you're going through this journey, I mean, you've spoken about South African writer and editor Noni Jabavu as really being seminal in having created a kind of consciousness about Black women's place and role in publishing within the UK,
Mm-hmm.
that space can exist. And you can do that, something like that for yourself. And, Noni Jabavu had been the editor, the first Black person, the first Black woman or woman to be the editor of a literary magazine, The New Strand. But there were also people like Toni Morrison and Alice Walker at that time who were examples to you. What kind of community, literary community in that way, did you have to cultivate in order to keep going and find inspiration at the time?
There was a lot of inspiration to be taken at the time from the Black British community. I mean, I started publishing with Alison Busby in 1967, but in 1966, a company called New Beacon Books was started by John LaRose from Trinidad. So he was the first Caribbean Black publisher in Britain in 1966. I started in 1967. In 1969, there was a woman called Jessica Huntley who, together with her husband Eric Huntley, started Bogle Louverture Publications. So she started in 69, and we were all connected in different ways. We used the same printers. We sometimes had authors in common or cover designers in common. And there was a collaborative feeling about that. Interesting thing, both Jessica Huntley and John LaRose were a generation older than I was. So that, they knew much more about life. And yet we did have that kindred feeling, particularly when the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books was founded in the early 80s and went on till the mid 90s. And that was something that Bogle Louverture, New Beacon Books, and Race Today publications were all part of. And that was an important initiative that brought together not only Black writing, Black publishing in Britain, but around the world. So there were people who came from the African continent, from the Caribbean, from North America, from Asia, and there was a sort of festival week that went along with the actual book fair, in which you had art exhibitions, poetry readings, music. So there was a cultural buzz around the Black Book Fair, as we call it for short, that was really powerful. And particularly, I remember a poetry concert, if you like, where there were wonderful poets reading their own work, whether it was Okot Bitek or Mikey Smith or Jean Winterbreeze. There were these iconic, wonderful poets who took part in the Black Book Fair. So that was an important thing that I took from the power of literature, if you like, that publishing was able to contribute to in that era. But there were writers I was publishing, for example, Buchi Macheta, who was a Nigerian woman who was in Britain at that time, who had begun writing a column in the New Statesman about her life, which became really important. And it was that column was turned into a book. Actually, the interesting thing about the New Statesman, the first piece of writing I ever had published in Britain in a national paper was in the New Statesman. And in fact, they'd wanted me to have a column, but I was too busy trying to set up a publishing company. So Buchi, I wanted to publish to make her story more widely known. She was having to go through as a African woman in Britain with all the challenges of being a single mother as she was with 5 children, trying to educate herself at the same time and bring up her family and be a writer. And the fact that we were able to publish Buchi's work and make a success of Buchi is something I think is an important contribution that we were able to make as publishers. So the American scene at that time, you'd have thought that there were just a handful of African American women writers. Alice Walker, as you've mentioned, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou. Toni Morrison, in particular, was an inspiration for me because she was an editor, as well as having been writing novels since the 70s, early 70s. She was an editor at Random House in New York, and she was the only Black editor I knew. So when I met her, she came over to Britain in the 70s, and I met her then, I think. And I talked with her, and she was very conscious of the fact that as a Black editor, if she took on a Black writer, she had to make sure that writer was successful so that the publisher didn't think, well, all Black writers didn't sell. So she was an inspiration to me in the late 70s, 80s. I met her she came to London, in fact, in 1987, I believe, when she was publishing, when the English edition of Beloved was being published. And at that time, she hadn't won any major prizes, but she was over here doing a promotional tour for Beloved. And there was a television program which had wanted to have Toni and me on talking about editing or publishing or something related to the industry. And they decided to drop the item. And I gather it was because they thought Toni was not well enough known. Because at that point, she hadn't won any prizes, any major awards around the world, or even in America. And in fact, there was a letter that 48 Black writers got together to sign in America, African American writers, literary people, trying to honor Toni in the wake of James Baldwin having died without winning any major prizes. So they had written this letter saying, well, we honor you, Toni. And when this program that we were meant to be going on in England didn't happen, there was a young Black filmmaker that I knew who just finished film school called Cinder Bridgelow. We decided we're going to make our own film. And so Toni had an hour free in her schedule. She didn't, she was being interviewed around, but we were going to use this hour to make our own film. So I didn't have time to reread the books, but we made our own interview. I interviewed Toni, and she went on, she won the Pulitzer Prize, and we sold our interview to Channel 4. And then she went on and she won the Nobel Prize in 93. And even then she was not well enough known, if you like, because somebody on a national newspaper actually asked me when they heard that the Nobel Literature Prize had been won by Toni Morrison, they said, who's he? So that all the acclaim that comes to Toni that she well deserved from the word go was not given her by the literary establishment until relatively late.
Right. I mean, and even I'm laughing, but it's a laugh cry, because so often, as you say, just the push by the African Americans, or the 48 who'd written the letter, was Baldwin dying without a particular kind of recognition, and I think that's something that throughout your career you've always being able to see. And what's always made you above or ahead of the curve is seeing and being able to identify what might be undervalued, or what we should be listening to, what we should be reading. And I think what's quite interesting is also within our own communities. Here I'm thinking about the famous or the infamous letter that you, or the exchange between yourself and Wole Soyinka when he was the editor of Transition magazine, and he had just published the anthology Poems from Black Africa, and he'd made a particular kind of omission and not quite recognizing the importance of Black women writers, and you had a word to say to him about that.
Well, I'm not sure that you could say, well, he didn't recognize the importance, but I think, I mean, that was a letter, that was after an encounter I had with Wole Soyinka, who I admire greatly, in the 70s. He must have been in Britain for some reason. He was at that time, he was editor of Transition magazine. I think I was sending him copies of our books to review as well. And as you say, in the 70s, I was commenting on the fact that I must have said something to him about the fact that there were not that many women in his anthology. And he wrote me back this letter, which I laugh about now, which is lovely. He was just saying that just shows how unbiased I am, and I'll try and do better next time. But it just, I didn't realize till I found that letter that consciousness of African women of African descent being excluded from the main canon had gone back that far, because that was the impetus, if you like, behind my wanting to do the anthology that became Daughters of Africa, because it was that feeling that you would see so many writers from everywhere, but if you talked about African American women writers, the impression would be that there were just a handful, and they would have to stand in for Black women writers everywhere, whether it was in Britain or anywhere. If you mentioned somebody in this country, there'd be some reference to Toni Morrison or Alice Walker, as if that was the only other Black women, those were the other Black women to refer to. So I wanted to get away from that fact and say, well, okay, this anthology of poetry from Africa doesn't have many women. This anthology of short stories from the Caribbean doesn't have many women. But actually, there are all these women writers who could have been in any of these anthologies over the decades, and I'm going to find a way to bring them together to showcase what they've contributed, what creativity there is in African women, going back not just 10 years, not just one generation, but going back to ancient Egypt. So that was the impetus behind my wanting to put together the anthology Daughters of Africa, which actually was published in 1992. But I think it was first conceived in the late 80s, probably around the same time as I was interviewing Toni Morrison. But there was a publishing company called Pandora Press, and there was this visionary young editor called Canada Lacey who works there. And Pandora had just published a book of British women writers with two editors, obviously in English, Britain. And talking with Canada, I decided I wanted to publish an anthology of Black women writers around the world, through the ages, on my own. And Canada was wonderfully supportive. And of course, she commissioned me. So it was originally commissioned by Canada when she was at Pandora. And then Pandora, I think, became part of HarperCollins. So Canada went there. I followed her there. And then Canada went on to Jonathan Cape. So I followed her there. And the anthology eventually came out from Jonathan Cape in 1992. And it was thanks to Canada's belief in me, if you like, that it was published in the end. And that was the start of a journey that's taken us right the way up to where we are now, why we're talking to each other now. And it was an anthology that contained more than 200 women of African descent from around the world, through the ages, generation upon generation, and it shows you just how much there was that had been written and spoken, because it contained orature as well as literature, spoken creativity by women that had been ignored. And a lot of the people who were included in that anthology at that point were not well known. Some of them were. Of course, it had Alice Walker and Maya Angelou and Toni Morrison and Terry McMillan, and the names that at that time were quite high profile. But it also had names of people who were starting out from other parts of the world. It had Jackie Kay in it. Jackie Kay, who's now the poet laureate of Scotland. It had people who were starting on their journey who had not yet got to the point where they were recognized by the mainstream, if you like. So that was what I wanted to highlight, if you like. There was a lot of creativity that was not getting attention, but nevertheless was worthy of attention and was by people who were influencing each other. There was a ripple effect. Sometimes you had people who were influenced generationally, who were writing because they'd read something by another woman, and that helped them write what they were writing. So there was a ripple effect as well as drawing on actual text. There was just the fact that you could do something because you'd seen another woman do it, another African woman. So it was possible. I don't know whether I'm making sense, but that was the continuum that I was trying to tap into, and that brought us right the way up to New Daughters of Africa in 19. No, who am I?
Well,
Not 19,
this is 2019.
2019, not
Well,
19. I've lost a generation or two. In
no, I mean,
2019.
you captured so many generations, and that's the amazing thing about what you achieve. I'm going to say achieve because it's not in past tense, but what you achieve with Daughters of Africa. It's an evergreen project. Just now, I'm going to ask you to read a little bit from the introduction, and telling us a little bit about where you get the name, but it's just to say that, you know, it is quite remarkable to see Black womanhood, or you know, across the ages, and you're going across geography, you're going across genre. So it's everything, as you say, it's orature, it's poetry, it's pamphleteering, and speeches, as well as, you know, essays and journalism. And so seeing that kind of variety and the different ways in which we're making ourselves heard or read on the page, as well as in song, and you know, that's really incredible. And to go back, as I did again, to Daughters of Africa, you see how so many of the themes that are there are really evergreen. So, for example, when you talk about the name Daughters of Africa in and of itself, you're talking about, you know, the politics around calling ourselves Black or colored, or, you know, should we capitalize, you know. So we're thinking just recently in the wake of George Floyd, for example, last year, there's this big push to have you know, Blackness, or Black capitalized with, you know, the letter B. But here you are, you're talking about Ida B. Wells talking about the fact that, well, we need to capitalize Negro. And somebody else a couple decades later saying, well, we need to have, we shouldn't be called Negroes, we should be called colored people, to recognize all the different shades of Blackness that we have. So all these different debates, it's so great to see the way in which you capture, to see a lot of the continuities as well as the changes. You know, and I don't believe in any sort of forward march of progress, but it's to kind of have a sense of, where are we coming from, where are we going to, or going back to. And it's a really wonderful testament that you created for us. And I'd just like to, well, first ask you about Daughters of Africa, the inspiration from Maria Stewart. How do we get to the name Daughters of Africa?
Yeah, the introduction begins with a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks called Two Black Women. Sisters, where there is cold silence, no hallelujahs, no hurrahs at all, no handshakes, no neon red or blue, no smiling faces, prevail, prevail across the editors of the world who are obsessed, self-honeying and self-crowned in the seduced arena. It has been a hard trudge, with fainting, bandaging, and death. There have been startling confrontations. There have been tramplings of monarchs and of other men. But there remain large countries in your eyes, shrewd sun, the civil balance, the listening secrets, and you create and train your flowers still. That was by Gwendolyn Brooks. The title Daughters of Africa I took from a quotation by Maria Stewart, who was the first African American woman to give a public lecture. And she wrote a passage in 1935 in a book that she published called Productions of Mrs. Maria W. Stewart. And that was where she said, O ye daughters of Africa, awake, awake, arise. No longer sleep nor slumber, but distinguish yourselves. Show forth to the world that ye are endowed with noble and exalted faculties. So that seemed to me a very apt endorsement, encouragement to African women writers, and that made it an obvious title for the anthology.
Thank you, Margaret. That's such a beautiful just summation of what Daughters of Africa has done, and thinking about the first edition, or Daughters of Africa, 2 New Daughters of Africa, which I have the fortune of being part of, having that sense of history and having that sense of lineage and archive. And we see the fact that so many people within the second anthology speak about the fact that, you know, Daughters of Africa opened a world for me. Whether it is someone like Edwidge Dora speaking about the fact that, well, for her as an African writer, she thought that African writing meant Nigerian writing, for example. So this freed her to think about, well, you know, I can write about or I can write a novel set in my own country, Cote d'Ivoire, for example. So it's opened up new vistas of imagination, not just as and against whiteness or patriarchy, but also within ourselves. And I think that's quite important. It's the kind of thing that I would hope for when we do have these spaces that are for us, that are by us, is having the debates or having the conversations and sometimes the tensions about what do we do when it's just us? What kind of world or what kind of vision do we have outside of whiteness or colonialism and patriarchy and all of those different things? There's certain kinds of conversations that are sometimes precluded when we are always trying to be included in particular kinds of ways. And I really love that. That's something that Daughters of Africa has been able to do, and to continue showing us that it can be done.
I think you're very right in that. That sense of being connected is, to me, very important. Connected with the first volume, connected to each other. That feeling that we're not alone, we're not doing things in isolation. I think that's where we should look for strength. It's the influences we can draw from each other, and it's very impressive how many people in New Daughters of Africa are connected through influence as well as other ways, through blood, if you like, blood relationships with Daughters of Africa. Whether you've got, you're thinking of somebody like Rebecca Walker in New Daughters, the daughter of Alice Walker, somebody like Na Dove in New Daughters, who's the niece of Mabel Dove Dankora in Daughters. So there are familial connections, as well as the fact that within New Daughters of Africa, there is a mother-daughter relationship, which I love. Zadie Smith is there, and Zadie Smith's mother, Yvonne Bailey Smith. And I think that feeling that we can all keep on learning, influencing each other, whatever our age, wherever we're from. And thinking back to the first volume, Daughters of Africa, I can remember very clearly going to a party and seeing, as I thought, an African woman across the room and talking with her, and realizing that she wasn't, as I thought, from Nigeria, but she was from Turkey. So there's a piece in Daughters of Africa by a Turkish woman called Aisha Birkin, which again shows you that you can be from Africa even though you're not based or born in Africa. And her story is important. And there's also somebody from Russia. And in New Daughters, there are people from all around the world. One of the poems I love in this book is called Chosen Family. And there is that feeling that we choose each other. We've chosen to be New Daughters of Africa. And I could do another book tomorrow, which is full of another 200 plus newer daughters of Africa. And again, going back generations and going from, as New Daughters goes, from somebody born in the 1870s to somebody born in the, yeah, we're going from people born in the 1790s to people born in the
In the
1990s.
1990s. That's
So you
me.
have a span of 200 years and more than 200 contributors. It just shows you what a wealth of talent, what a wealth of creativity there is to draw on. And there's so much more. There are people that you would have hoped might have been in this volume who are not there, not included deliberately, but sometimes people miss the deadline or they didn't get the email. And there's a long list I have of people who will be in the next volume if I get a chance to do another volume. And again, it's exciting to see the different genres and the fact that I was surprised in so many ways. I would write to somebody who was a novelist, for example, expecting to get some prose fiction back, and I would get some poetry. So the women writers themselves were challenging themselves in terms of the forms they chose. So it was not only poetry or short stories or extracts from novels or letters or political writing or experimental writing. It was just anything you could think of.
I think that's quite beautiful. The fact that, I might be well known for a particular genre, but on the invitation of Margaret Busby, I decide that my mark in literary history is going to be something different, something that I'm not quite, or at least I might have been working on for a long time. And this is the first time I'm sharing it in the world. And the fact that you choose this to be the cradle of this new baby. And I think it just speaks to the kind of space that you created, to know that you're in good company, you're in safe hands. And
I'd also like to point out the fact that there's somebody in here, more than one person, somebody like Ella Wakatama, who is thought of as an editor or a publisher, but she's a
right, she's my
brilliant
publisher,
writer.
she's my editor.
She's your editor. And you know
Exactly.
when I first met Ella, she was working at Penguin, and I remember going to a Penguin party, and I was used to going to parties where there were no other black people apart from occasional people who handed out the canapes, if you like. And I saw another black woman across the room, and that was Ella. And we bonded, we got together. I wrote something when she was doing the Penguin Modern Classics. I wrote an introduction to a Bessie Head book she was publishing, and we became friends from then on and collaborators, and we kept in touch. And I am just delighted that she is in New Daughters of Africa as a writer in her own right, because she writes brilliantly, and
she does.
You're lucky to have her as your editor.
No, she's absolutely fantastic, and that's how I got to meet you. So these connections, she told me about this, and she said, do you think you'd like to be part of this? And I said, absolutely, and you'd come to my book launch, and it was fantastic. So I just think
your book is brilliant. The book that she published,
thank you,
is excellent.
It's a big compliment coming from you, and it just, I think, again, I can't emphasize for me, again, I remember going to SOAS at University of London at that time, and the meeting of women from so many different backgrounds and generations. I mean, we were all fangirling, for example, over Carolyn Cooper's amazing dress. I mean, she had her dreads with sort of her silver dreads with the hair, the sort of fade on the side, and a bright red jacket. We're taking selfies with her. Then Angela Davis walks in. It was just a really great space to be in which to be Black women in all our different shades. And I mean, it's really great as we read this, just like with the original Daughters of Africa, seeing sort of Afro-German Black women, we're seeing Afro-Caribbean Black women, we're seeing Lusophone Black women, just that kind of multiplicity. And I think it's so important at a particular juncture in history where I think there's sometimes a turn away from Pan-Africanism. There's a way, particularly sometimes, it might be Africans who don't see themselves as Black, for example. I mean, continental Africans. It might be, and this is particularly in the post-revolutionary age, so post-civil rights, post-apartheid, and that kind of thing, where there's a particular kind of nationalist turn, where we become so involved in making the nation state work. Whereas in the past, we understood that Black freedom, Black liberation needed to necessarily be beyond borders, across the waters. But we've seemed to lose that. And one of the things that I see quite a lot of, one, even in the academic space, there's this sort of, a turn away from Africa. So Black studies doesn't do Africa, African studies doesn't do race. And in that kind of way, we kind of lose sight of the things that do bind us. So, for example, last year there was George Floyd as well as InSARS, and both about police violence that targets people of African descent. And yet we sometimes want to think about these struggles as separate from each other, and thinking about someone like a Barack Obama being elected without and celebrating that uncritically, without thinking about, well, what about AFRICOM and the militarization on the African continent, or the US destabilizing Afro-Caribbean populations in Latin America? All of those different kinds of things that we're not always thinking about our struggles as interlinked. And particularly, all this is to come back to an earlier point that you were making about making the connections apparent, and the relations between us, because I find that one of the words that is often bandied about or spoken of in this moment is wounded kinship. So this idea that there is a kind of the door of really taking seriously the idea, or reifying the door of no return. So once Middle Passage had happened, we're completely separated. And yet, I think even in the example of your family, we're seeing that it's not just a case of retentions, it's a case of a call and response that continually happens between Africa and Afro diaspora. And you show this and you make it manifest for us in this book. So it's really such a wonderful example to all of us who are thinking about Pan-Africanism in this moment.
Well, I think you put it very well. I have little to add to that, because you've summed it up so brilliantly. But I think that there is that thing, we have to hold on to those connections. But it's not that we have to exclude other things. It's a way of enriching everyone's lives. And it's not that I'm saying, or you're saying, or anybody's saying, that only African women can read the anthologies. No, we hope everybody will read them and be enriched by them. That's what I hope will be the legacy, if you like, that the word is spread wider, that people get more conscious of what is being said by women of African descent, which may affect their own lives, whether or not they're of African descent.
No, completely. And I'm actually, just funny enough, right in front of me is the Toni Morrison quote that you cite in your introduction, which says, and particularly around this apprehension that people will feel around being so-called labeled or categorized as a Black woman writer. And she says, I really think the range of emotions and perceptions I've had access to as a Black person and as a female person are greater than those of people who are neither. So it seems to me that my world did not shrink because I was a Black female writer. It just got bigger. Exactly. And I really love that, because I think in this, when you think about these two tomes and the fact that these are only, as you say, these are only drops in the river and the oceans that make our being, that there's such a big world. And I think, again, your contribution is making us aware of the fact that there's so much more. And if we feel thirsty when reading this, there's so much more, and it's work for a next generation to do as well.
Exactly. And I really can't wait to be able to compile another anthology, because there are so many writers I have come across who are new to me, as well as writers who I couldn't get into this volume.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the volume could have been 3 times the size
Mm-hmm.
had I had my own way. But there's just so much wisdom. There's so much excitement. There's so much creativity to be found in what's being produced by women of African descent, which is not necessarily given the space for expression that it deserves. And I think that is what I want to try and fight back against, that we need to have the space to say what we need to say in the way we need to say it, to each other as well as to the world in general.
I love that. Thank you, Margaret, for your example, for your spirit and your energy. I know that it's easy to look back now and to look on now and say, well, Margaret has so much energy and we don't know where it comes from, but it's a lot of work. And we hope that we're going to continue to celebrate you and make sure that you get your flowers in your lifetime. Although I don't think it can ever be enough, but the little that we can do to continue to recognize you for what you've done and just for widening our imaginations as to what's possible for us. We're forever in your debt.
Thank you, Panashe. I really love talking with you. Let's go on.
Subscribe to the New Daughters of Africa podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. On social media, follow at InterKontinental, at InterKontinental on Twitter and Instagram, as well as myself at PANASHE_CHIG on Twitter and at PANASHECHIGUMADZI on Instagram. The New Daughters of Africa podcast is a production of InterKontinental, a non-profit association dedicated to the promotion of African and Afro-diasporic literature based in Berlin, Germany. It's made possible with funding by the Berlin City Senate Department for Culture and Europe. Original theme music by Toke, podcast artwork by Adrian Wilkins.